Well, we're going to start. Thank you all for being here. Hello. Nice to see you again. Good evening. My name is Paola Antonelli, and together with Christina Mouchot, I run this outfit. And we're number 52 of this outfit. So 52 outfits for the past 10 plus years that have touched, thank you, that have touched on many different facets of our life, from dogs to protest to anger. And now we're going to talk about cold. It's cold out there. Well, you see here this pretty gorgeous installation by Terence Simon that we're going to talk about more at length later on. But I would like to introduce our real host for the night. It's not me, and it's instead Nicola Twilley. Nikki, come here next to me. Come. So Nikki is an old friend and partner in crime. She's a great writer. I'm sure that you have all read her pieces, either once upon a time in the New York Times Magazine and now on the New Yorker. She writes about all sorts of weird stuff that people don't really normally even think of. And refrigeration has been her obsession for the past 15 years. Before that, 15, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Before that, there were quarantine spaces, so way before COVID, she and her partner, Jeff Mano, were workshopping, and were writing about quarantine. She also runs a podcast and a web page called Gastropod about eating food and all that's behind food. And also, she has published last November, or even further behind. Oh, in July, see, it was too hot. She's published this book called Frostbite that talks about how refrigeration has changed our food, our life, and ourselves. And by the way, the book is going to be for sale afterwards outside if anybody is interested. So I'm going to give her the word right now so that she can introduce the evening, but then we're going to have some wonderful guests, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see them outside, but we have two demos, one by Shintaro Okamoto, it's the beautiful ice sculpture that you've seen, and the other one by Kip Bradford. It's an air conditioning unit that he'll tell us about. So for the first time, we also have a few demos and props here. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce Nicola Twilley here. And do you have your instrument of power? Here it is.
No, that's what I need.
Okay. And off we go to the races. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you, Paola. Paola and Christina actually did everything. I just showed up, so they are the ones who deserve all the credit. But as Paola mentioned, I have spent the past 15 years in the cold. So when we say it's cold out there, that's where I've been, researching what became Frostbite, my book. And because of that, I can and will, unprompted, spend hours talking about why our relationship with cold is so important and so essential right now. For both reasons of deliciousness, which is extremely important, but also for our health, the health of our environment at scales both domestic, urban, and planetary. But before you all panic, I'm not going to do that tonight. Instead, we have this amazing group of speakers gathered here, and they are going to talk about aspects of cold. What I wanted to do with the introduction is just kind of introduce some things that struck me from my experience writing my book as the most extraordinary aspects of cold that might resonate across their research. So the idea is sort of thinking thermally, a little introduction to thinking thermally, and hopefully it will make a new kind of sense of the world and allow you to see things that were previously invisible and imagine things that were previously impossible. So, first of all, one key thing to know about cold is that most of its power comes from its ability to slow time. So that in turn helps it reconfigure space, but really what it's doing is slowing time. And so for the book, I spent some time working in a refrigerated warehouse, and everything seemed curiously dimmed and muffled. And that's because, in fact, in the cold, the air is thicker, sound and light travel more slowly. Humans are also slowed down by the cold. So the technical medical term for this is cold stupid. You get what is called, again, technical medical term, the umbles. you grumble, mumble, stumble, and fumble. And for warehouse work, literally the planners sort of take what it would take at, for the work plan, they will calculate how long this would take at ambient temperature and add time, because humans are slowed by cold. But of course, food is also, its lifespan is extended through this slowing of time. That's how it preserves food, by slowing time down. So for things like meat or milk, what it's doing is slowing down the metabolism of the microbes and fungi that want to eat this stuff before we can. For produce, which is really fascinating, produce is still alive. Like us, it has a certain number of breaths it can take before it dies. And the whole trick is to slow down how fast it takes those breaths so that it lives longer. So I show this picture of apples because apples have one of the most sophisticated life extension regimes out there. You think those Silicon Valley billionaires with their, injections of young blood and such like are on top of life extension. Let me tell you, apples, there's a different prescription for each variety. These apples here they sort of had this, a box of apples in a warehouse will be controlling the atmosphere of the entire warehouse using their own exhalations. So, sorry, tech billionaires, but you are not on it. And this sophisticated life extension protocol is what allows this slowing of time, but also this rearranging of geography. So you get, for example, in the case of produce, a lot of the time you get like a sequence of California analogs that are spread around the world. For example, avocados, California, sort of May through July, Mexico, sort of October through February, but then you have Peru standing in for a summer bump, and you have Chile standing in for like a winter supplement. And so it sort of distorts both space and time in the end. It also, of course, moves food production further away, so it divorces us from food production, and it severs us from the seasons. You have what has been called the permanent global summertime of the supermarket, which is the underlying energy behind that is a perpetual and unchanging winter of refrigerated warehouses. So, cold slows time. Cold is also chilling, and not just in the literal sense, but in the uncanny sense. So it distorted what geographer Suzanne Friedberg has called the known physics of freshness. So what that is before refrigeration, if you saw a chicken, or an apple for that matter, that looked fresh, well, you knew how old it was, when it had been harvested, and how far away. It could not possibly be 6 months old and from thousands of miles away, because there was no way it would still look fresh. And so once refrigeration made that possible, it threw people for a loop. Suddenly, the very sort of nature of freshness was in question. It was something that you couldn't assume anymore. And that really discombobulated people. There was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of fear. People thought it was zombie food, potentially immoral even, to sort of interrupt the sort of known progression toward decay. This menu I love because it's from the world's first cold storage banquet, at which everything that was served came from a refrigerator. Amazing, except for the olives and the dry martini, apparently. So, and when this was held in 1911 in Chicago. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, how cute. They're celebrating this magical new technology they have. No. This is a PR stunt. This is panic PR to try to convince people that you won't die if you eat refrigerated food. Literally, the toasts were like, applauding the diner's bravery for eating this meal. The headline in the Journal of the American Medical Association the next day was like, well, this doesn't prove anything. So cold storage food is still deadly. So that kind of response was humans' sort of initial response to the uncanny, chilling nature of cold. And of course, that has completely changed today. Today, freshness has, instead of becoming something that has a known physics of space and time, it's become an article of faith. It's become a belief system. And Americans in particular just do food that does not come from the refrigerator cannot be truly fresh. This Chipotle ad has been driving me mad lately. Any of you who watch TV, which, shamefully, I still do, might have seen it. And it's like, this chicken comes fresh. This chicken is real. It really highlights that, chicken that has been refrigerated is the only real chicken anymore. And on that note, the fridge has gone from being this sort of this uncanny zombie sort of effect to a guarantor of safety, health, and abundance. So that the fridge will keep food safe and fresh kind of eternally, until it doesn't, of course, and becomes a cleaner, colder trash can. So a third sort of highlight of thinking thermally is this idea of cold's changeability. So kind of ironically, for something we use to preserve, it is extremely ephemeral, and it is extremely capable of causing transformation. So one thing that struck me when I began working on this book is humans have been able to add heat. We've controlled fire since before we became modern humans. I mean, many scientists think that is indeed why we became modern humans. Making cold, taking heat away from things, that is incredibly recent. It's really only in the past century and a half that we have been able to do that at will. It's only in the past century that that's been a domesticated sort of skill set of us. So it's an incredibly recent addition to our powers over nature. And what that serves as a reminder is that for most of human history, cold was ephemeral. It was outside of our control. It was mysterious. It was fleeting. And we used it only for pleasure. Cold was something you used to make wine slushies in the summer, ice cream after the technology was developed in Italy, one of its gifts to the world. But really, just no one had any sense of using it for practical purposes. And when we first figured out actually how to do it mechanically, it was seen as a party trick. No one had any sort of sense of like, this is going to transform food and architecture and medicine. No, absolutely not. It was sort of like, why would we do this? And it took a high school dropout from Boston to launch the frozen water trade and send ice all over the world to sort of show that ice at scale can change the world. This thing that melts and is purely about pleasure, this fleeting kind of treat, could, if you made it big enough and you made it able to stick around for long enough, could change the world. And at that time, North America's winters, that was like Saudi oil. We had so much ice, we ruled the world. So, So, and at that moment, that's when something that was so fleeting and so decadent and had purely been about pleasure became essential infrastructure. So essential that it's basically invisible. So what I do in the book is I trace its impact instead. I try to make it visible by showing what it makes possible. And so this is just a small smattering of, refrigeration as being responsible for the invention of the cheeseburger, Tupperware, the hoodie. It played a vital role in Irish independence. We have it to thank for the banana's rise to being the world's most popular fruit, also the rise of banana republics. It redesigned everything from our gut microbiome to the landscape of the North York moors. And once you end up, and this is why it took me 15 years to write this book, once you end up trying to trace what refrigeration has changed, what cold has done to our world, you end up down more rabbit holes than you can mention. So, final thought before we launch into this evening's preservation, and this really is why cold matters so much right now, is that as our artificial cryosphere expands, our natural one shrinks. So scientists call the world's poles and glaciers the natural icy spaces. Those are called the cryosphere. As I explored the sort of billions of cubic feet of artificial winter we've built, I realized if you thought of it all together, this is an artificial cryosphere. This is a third pole. And then, of course, the irony is that as this artificial cryosphere expands, that is a key driver in the vanishing of the natural cryosphere. So, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Kip is going to talk more about the thermodynamic bind we find ourselves in, I think. But the long and short is that we really cannot continue cooling as usual. It's not an option. So, of course, what they say about, every crisis is an opportunity. For me, the opportunity to think thermally is to say, here's this incredibly recent, incredibly powerful addition to our human control of nature. It has changed everything about how we eat, where our food is grown, what it tastes like, how good it is for us and the planet. Can we think thermally and change those relationships? But then also, as we will see from everyone else this evening, cold has been that transformative in a range of other dimensions. It's changed how we live and even what we think of as alive. So on that note, I am going to hand it over to Paula again to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you so much. And from this presentation, you can understand why so many artists have been focusing also on the theme of cold. I was almost thinking, are we stealing cold from nature to use it ourselves? Anyway, let's not wax poetic right now. Let's do it at the end. So we have an amazing group of speakers tonight to help us think this through. And I'm going to just show to you David Gisson, who's a professor of architecture at Yale, Kip Bradford, engineer, teaching at Harvard and expert in thermodynamics and more. Shintaro Okamoto, ice sculptor. You've seen the sculpture outside. That's his doing. It's quite amazing. And then last but not least, also Joanna Radin. And, we will talk about everything with all of them. Oh, yeah, sorry. She's an associate professor of the history of medicine and much more, but she's quite polyhedric, I could tell already from what she was telling me that she's working on right now. And besides their presentations, we will also have these videos, as usual, from artists and philosophers and scientists that will add, and architects too, and will add their viewpoint to what we are discussing. So we're going to start right now with two videos by Wolfgang Ketterle and Philip Mon.
Very low temperatures are very important for science and research. At absolute zero, all the random motion of atoms, molecules, and electrons comes to a standstill. And at absolute zero, we can prepare systems of materials, systems of particles and materials in their absolute ground state. No random motion anymore. This provides us an opportunity to observe phenomena of quantum mechanics without being masked, without being blurred by the random thermal motion. So in other words, absolute zero provides us a new window into the quantum world where we can observe phenomena and find materials with new properties which would not exist at higher temperature. In my research with ultra-cold atoms, we can cool atoms down to temperatures which are only a billionth of a degree, 1 nanokelvin above absolute zero. These are temperatures which are a billion times lower than interstellar space. So you can say, if you go from the earthly environment to interstellar space, the temperature which is the absolute temperature in Kelvin, which is a measure for the kinetic energy of particles, drops by a factor of 100. But when you go from interstellar space to our laboratory, the temperature drops by another factor of 1 billion. And it is at those low temperatures that we can make discoveries and find new aspects of quantum science. And it is also at low temperatures that we can now harness quantum science for quantum technologies, applications for quantum sensors, quantum computation, and quantum communication.
Hello everyone, my name is Philip Morn. I'm a writer and researcher from London, but today I'm in Nukus, which is in Karakalpakstan, which you may not have heard of, but it's an autonomous region in the west of Uzbekistan. And this river beside me is the Amu Darya, which is a river that passes through Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and all of those countries take water from it. As a result, the Aral Sea has dried up. You probably know about this environmental catastrophe. It's the reason why children in Nukus, where I am, have cancer rates far in excess of anyone else in the rest of the country. They have infections in their eyes, blindness and infertility are widespread. Why am I mentioning this in relationship to cold? The question I was asked is, does the future of food require cold? And I'm sure that it does in lots of different ways, perhaps not in the way that we operate with the cold chain today. But the Aral Sea, has been keeping this area humid, shaded, increasing precipitation, and managing the temperature overall for many thousands of years. And without it, Nukus and the desert that surrounds it has become far hotter in the summer and far colder in the winter. And so all I would put to you guys in New York is that maybe we ought to think about the way that the landscape and the climate itself acts as a refrigerator, and what difference can be, is inevitable when sea levels rise, when lakes dry up, and when communities built around one particular mode of temperature stabilization are no longer able to continue there. Thank you.
To you, then to the podium, Kip Bradford.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Nikki, and the other speakers. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you all for joining us for a topic that I will also wax poetic on for days on end, as Nikki knows. And if you're lucky enough to be in Rhode Island, you can come to my garage and I will build a refrigerator with you. But today, hopefully this doesn't make you panic. We're gonna start with a little bit of physics, and we're gonna do some science together here at the MoMA. Fortunately, this is a very easy experiment. So I want all of you to participate, and all I'm gonna ask you to do is to rub your hands together. Put some force into it. But make sure your palms get nice and warm. All right, that's great. You can stop. You all have just raised the temperature in this room by about 1,000th of a degree. But more importantly, we've just created some heat. We've created some heat by leveraging force, by using our muscle power to convert chemical energy from our muscles into mechanical energy and then to thermal energy. And that is a really profound conversion that you just performed. It's profound because it underlies so many mechanisms in the way society works: jet engines, car engines, power plants, refrigerators. But creating heat is pretty easy. What would happen if I asked you to create some cold? Well, some of you might run outside and stand out until you get cold and come back in and say, ta-da. But no, I want you to go from force, from energy, to make something colder. And there's a secret to that, which is that cold is not the creation of something, it's the removal of something. It's the removal of heat from the system. So how can we remove heat from the system? Well, counterintuitively, in order to make cold, we must first make things hot. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a conceptual experiment this time. And now, instead of using the force in my hands to rub my hands together and generate some friction and turn that force into heat, that work into heat, I'm going to take a 1 meter cube of air and I'm going to squeeze it to about 1,000th the size. The pressure is going to increase and the temperature is going to increase. And we have this relationship that's a property of matter, property of gas. Now, once I do that, I could just let go and let it re-expand, and the temperature would go back down, the pressure would go back down, we would return to our original state. But what happened if I do this squeezing process? Now I have this hot, little tiny cube of gas, and it's hotter than the room. And I let the heat leak out into the room. Now this little cube of gas is at room temperature. Now think about what happens if I let it re-expand back into its 1 meter cube. Well, the heat has to go back into it. And the only way the heat can go back into it is if it gets colder than the room was. So you just created a refrigerator. All right, I'm going to take you away from physics, and we're going to go to my next favorite subject, which is chemistry. We've been talking about this little cube of air, but in real refrigeration systems, we can improve the efficiency of that cooling process by taking advantage of properties of matter like density, heat capacity, boiling points, and other particular interesting properties of specific gases that perform the work inside a refrigerator. And the original gases that we used were naturally occurring substances that scientists had known about for a while, and they knew that they had some pretty interesting properties that were thermally advantageous, but they also had some not so ideal practical issues, like they were toxic, they were flammable, they were explosive, and we really were striving for cooling without getting blown up. And that takes us to an incredible invention, which was if you take a substance like methane, which is a really good refrigerant, or butane or propane, the reason it blows up is because you have this very high energy bond between the carbon and the hydrogen. If you want to take that substance and have similar properties or better properties but get rid of the explosiveness, well, you can do that by reacting it with chlorine and fluorine, which have very, very strong bond energy, and all of a sudden you have Freon. And by the way, this is also where we get Teflon from as an accidental byproduct of this reaction. But Freon was a substance that had the great refrigeration properties that we wanted, and none of the explosiveness and toxicity that would cause stuff to kill people. But over the next half century, those chlorinated, fluorinated substances punched a hole in our ozone layer, as you know. The bulk impact of refrigeration is also 40% of the global warming forcing function. So that gives us some very interesting engineering practical challenges. How do we get the cooling that powers modern society, but without breaking laws of physics? How do we get the positive with none of the negative? We're fundamentally bound by a set of properties of matter that allow this mechanical or electrical energy to be converted into thermal energy. And we're also bound by the physics limits to the efficiencies of the processes. Every time we come up with a new type of refrigerant, there's some unintended consequence, whether it's ozone layer damage, toxicity, etc. So we have to think differently. We need to do things differently within the context of these constraints. And that's the work that I do. Continuing the status quo is simply not acceptable. So in 2008, I had this silly idea that we shouldn't be cooling and heating spaces, we should be cooling and heating people. Why do we put so much energy into HVAC, air conditioning, refrigeration to make the building at a particular temperature? Why don't we find ways to make people achieve the comfort levels that they want? So I invented a technology that I patented that was trying to bring the cooling and the heating closer to people and using less energy. In 2017, I joined a company that I brought my patents to called Gradient, and we got a Time Magazine Invention of the Year award in 2022. I've since left that company and am working with a number of new teams. One of them is rethinking the building and the thermal devices within it as an intelligent energy ecosystem, where energy that's wasted, could have been wasted in one part of the building, can get recycled and regenerated and be productive in another part of the building. This is led by an engineer from Google who cut power consumption in the server farms by running artificial intelligence on all the controls in those complex thermal networks. And that is the demo that you'll see outside. It's a team called Normal Robotics Company doing air conditioning and heating. I'm also working with, oh, there we go. I'm also working with another team that's minimizing thermal work, thermal energy in water heating by predicting when people use the water, the hot water, and running a much more efficient thermal process using a heat pump instead of burning gas or using electric resistance heating, and doing that when it's cheapest and easiest to make that conversion from electricity into thermal energy. Back to the food cold chain, it's really interesting when you look at how the cold chain uses refrigeration. We refrigerate coming from the farm, we put things in cold storage, we go from cold storage to a refrigerated grocery store to your refrigerator in your house. What if you could make the entire system more efficient and reduce the loss in the system by minimizing the nodes in that network? So Fresh Truck was a solar-powered mobile community refrigerator that redefined farm to table. It would collect freshly harvested food in the morning from the farms, drive to the town square, and then people could go sort of on demand and get fresh food, cook it, use it, and there's no refrigerated grocery stores, no warehouses, no refrigerated intermodal transport that you need to do that. Final project that I'll just highlight, thinking about positive ways that we can rethink our cooling infrastructure. I'm working with a fantastic team of designers in Europe who are minimizing energy by leveraging advanced manufacturing techniques, traditional materials, and applying them to local climatic conditions to get really interesting evaporative cooling systems that integrate with the architecture, the classic architecture of buildings in Spain and Italy. And I'm going to end on a slightly snarky but positive note. There is hope. Refrigeration is a powerful technology with profound impact. And we need to really continually explore ways to use it to its greatest potential while minimizing the downside. And I'll leave you with that image and that thought and move on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So many ideas, and those cooling systems using traditional materials just belong here in the collection. We'll talk about it later, but we now have a video by Mia Bennett.
Arctic sea ice is shrinking, but did you know it's getting dangerously thinner too? Back in the 1970s and 80s, people in Greenland, that island that most certainly is not up for sale, had to carve staircases into the ice to reach its bottom, from where they dig holes to fish for halibut. Traditionally, this sort of thick ice stays frozen year in, year out. It's the type of fantastically sculpted ice found in 19th century romantic paintings. This stuff so impassable it terrified explorers like Captain Cook. North of the Bering Strait in 1778, he was forced to turn back after encountering ice he described as compact as a wall 10 or 12 feet high. In the 1980s, this multi-year ice, as it's called, still made up 20% of the Arctic's cover. Now, it only makes up 3%. In its place is thin first-year ice that can barely support the weight of a fisher or a hunter, let alone a dog sled or a polar bear. The ice that once served as a rock-solid foundation for hunters and animals is now liable to suddenly collapsing under their weight. This poses potentially fatal risks like drowning. Arctic ice has become so thin because much of it no longer stays frozen through hotter and hotter summers. As the atmosphere heats up, sea ice is melting into the dark waters of a warming Arctic Ocean. Some of this water refreezes in winter, but only as a pale imitation of its former self. In recent winters, a lot of the Arctic Ocean hasn't refrozen at all. In geological terms, this climate disaster happened overnight. In 2005, and then again in 2007, the ocean became so warm that Arctic sea ice was not able to grow back to anywhere near its normal extent once winter came around. Scientists call this a regime shift in the thickness of Arctic Ocean sea ice, and it's a shift that is irreversible. For people like Greenlanders who have to contend with this change, it's like the Earth is slipping out from under their feet.
Shintaro Okamoto to keep talking about ice.
Well, good evening. My name is Shintaro Okamoto. I'm the founder and creative director of Okamoto Studio, which is an artist collective that work with ice here based in Queens, New York. Guess, what I bring into this talk is that we use ice as a working material with, I guess, I feel like hearing all these conversations, I'm partly the culprit. I'm the receiving end of all this technology, and I think the history that brought us to what we can do. But then, it's in my daily doing that I think about ice and really embrace ice as a physical material, emotional translations, a psychological, I think, outcome that comes from the material, a metaphorical element that we always think about every day. The ice we use are made with industry standard machineries that makes a crystal clear block that's about sized 40 inches by 20 inches by 10 inches, about 275 pounds. It's a machine that makes 2 blocks at a time. It takes about 3 to 4 days to cycle. I have, dozens of these machines that produce these things and make up these things. We go through about 100 and 150 blocks a week, creating various sculptures, installations for fashion shows, film premieres, product launches, weddings, bar mitzvahs, all around, all the way down to really bespoke hand-cut cocktail ice for high-end bars and restaurants. So we really, embrace the needs and the use that go through on a daily basis from all different aspects of industries. We get to put on various hats with the benefit of being able to manipulate this material, working with the top tastemakers and brands that is thinking what cold and chilled and what ice is and brings it out to the world through, I think, marketing outlets to events outlets and whatnot. I have a pretty, I think, special, unique, a privilege in being able to encounter this material growing up. My father was an ice sculptor. I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. I always have to say not all Alaskans play with ice, but I did. I always had, blocks of ice hanging around, and it's something that I've always really kind of really embraced. I've had my years training as an artist. My training is in painting. Went to undergrad at Brown. I did my MFA at Hunter College, and coming out of that, I really came to revisit ice as a working material, and founded my studio at 2003, and here I am now. It's all I do. And even with the previous presentation, say, well, I'm in a process of building a new freezer, and all these issues from the ecological aspects to how do we make it as efficiently as possible to, the storage and what that means for us future is always on my desk, and I'm always scratching my head. So everything about this talk tonight is incredibly fascinating and humbling and guilty as what we have to do every day. But at the end, I'm going to touch on a little bit on what Nicola talked about in presentation first. Ice as slowing of time. Again, my job is to physicalize this as an art form. And, we do a lot of freezing of various items inside the ice. I've done work with a florist, Makoto Azuma, who's a globally known florist who became famous freezing flowers inside blocks of ice as part of a fashion show runways. But he had moved on to having these frozen bonsai trees, and that he would shoot it up in the rockets and put it out in space. Again, at the end, what we do is to create these imageries, to physicalize these things. And I think it is an artist's job is to create the questions of what these things can do. In my talk with many of my clients, I always talk about how ice is that physicalization of that timelessness, that's stopping the time. And I think ice is so fitting to the events industry because we physicalize that time. And when you see how much we've given details and qualities to work, and you see this thing melting, like the sculpture I have out there, it's melting. And you guys will be the only people here tonight that get to see it and to touch it. And then what you see out there after this talk is going to look a little different. The ice we use is crystal clear. It has its own processes that take out all the air bubbles away from it. It's really densely frozen. The speed of the melting really has to do with how much air bubble there is to it and all that. So, when you see the sculpture, when you see it melting, you see it dripping, I think you realize the time of passing. And I think there's that romantic notion that I think is true and I think is inevitable. And I think it makes that moment that much more precious. And I really take that to heart. And I really think about these things to do what we do. It's an ever fascinating and humbling material that we get to work with every day. So that's my little take. Thank you.
And now, you make it seem so simple, but I have to say that the peeing dog, probably you had to calculate everything. I want to know more about how you achieved that. And now we have a video by Floris Winkel.
If you've ever looked closely at a snowflake before, you wouldn't have been the first. Throughout the history of science, snowflakes, or snow crystals, have been studied by all sorts of different people in all sorts of different places. Why and how they did so differed from case to case, as did the lessons that they drew from those studies. For instance, the German mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler, writing in 1610, argued that studying the snowflake could teach us about how geometrical things in nature grow. A century and a half after him, a Dutch doctor published a book about how studying the snowflake could bring us closer to God. A century later, a British meteorologist and his wife suggested that snowflakes could serve as valuable sources of inspiration for artists and designers looking for new patterns. 80 years after them, a Japanese physicist called them letters from the sky and argued that they could be studied to learn the state of the atmosphere at any point in time. Nowadays, researchers are studying pockets of ancient air in ice cores, once brought down by snowflakes, to study the state of the atmosphere hundreds of thousands of years ago. When we think about the snowflake, we tend to think about how frivolous and fleeting it is. But if snowflakes had collective memory, consider their perspective. All these different observers with their different questions and their different instruments, come and go, and yet these little flakes remain. The snowflake has always been a canvas on which people have projected their scientific hopes and expectations onto. Learning from the snowflake ultimately means learning about ourselves.
And now it's my turn. I'm here as a presenter today, which is kind of wonderful. We wanted to show you a little bit, thank you, show you a little bit about how artists interpret everything that we've heard so far and that we will hear later in the day. You know, we've been talking about cold as preserving time, as preserving bodies, as extracting and being the absence of heat. So here are a few examples, and we're going to start with one of Christina and my favorite artists, Taryn Simon. You've seen at the beginning of the presentation a view of this installation, a cold hole that she did in 2018 at MoMA. It was really like a nice cold plunge. You know, we've heard so much about cold plunges. They are a spiritual practice, something that you do in special days and that you do with a special community. Now that become also a little bit more of a fashionable feature to have in gyms. You know, I don't know if you know, but also Chelsea Piers just has inserted 2 cold plunges. But it was just really amazing to see this installation that I confess I did not know about. That was actually at MoMA and actually featured real people doing a cold plunge, the pain and I guess also the delight of ice and what it means when it encounters the human body. So the reason why I was looking for Taryn's work is because I remembered this series from, I think it was 2008, 2004 actually, that she had done when she was looking for all the hidden places on Earth. She had gained access to some facilities for quantum computing or, you know, level 4 chemical labs. I mean, it was just like this peep show into some of the most hidden places on Earth. And she had taken a picture of this cryopreservation unit where the mother and the first wife of the inventor of cryonics, Robert Ettinger, who's still alive, were preserved after their death. So it's this amazing way to look at cryostasis. And this Cryonics Institute is also quite pragmatic about it. You see, cryostasis costs $28,000 if you plan quite a bit before death. You know, it's like airplanes and flights. And instead, it's $35,000 on short notice. So just so you know. But it's really interesting to see how it is an industry and it has become an industry. Well, and now for something that is closer to home is the famous snowman that was installed also here at the Museum of Modern Art in the Garden in the summertime by Fischli and Weiss. This is a new version of something that had originally been commissioned in Austria by a plant that would use the thermal energy produced by the plant to actually cool down the snowman. And instead at MoMA, it was within this kind of refrigerator. It was a copper structure upon which humidity was pumped, and then it formed the ice crystals. And it actually consumed about 4,000 BTU compressor. So pretty much like a small window unit of air conditioner like the ones used in New York. So in this case, it really is a sculpture that almost anyone can make. That's what Fischli said, but created in this kind of almost absurd, crazy way to be positioned in a situation that is not its normal context. And it's something similar to what Tavares Tran did. Tavares was born in the Bahamas, and at some point he went to the Arctic and he took this big block of ice, I'll tell you exactly the size, a 2.5-ton piece of ice from a frozen river, and then he shipped it to the Bahamas, where he exhibited it in the summer weather using the energy of the sun to keep it cold. So also this exchange, you know, cold and ice is so fascinating because of this idea of the absence of heat. Michael Wang actually was hoping to be here tonight. He couldn't come because he had another engagement at Columbia University, damn it, but he sent us a video. If we can take, yeah, thank you.
Much of Shanghai's power comes from dams on the Yangtze and its tributaries, including from the Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest power plant. High-voltage cables run parallel to the Yangtze, linking the dam to Shanghai like a second river. The city relies on the river for its water as well as its electricity. Shanghai is at the river's terminus. Its source, 6,000 kilometers away, is a vastly different world, the glaciers of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. The work 10,000 Li, 100 billion kilowatt hours, recreates, in Shanghai, the glaciers at the source of the Yangtze. To work made of water and energy, Yangtze water and Yangtze energy. The work plugs into and emerges from the infrastructures of the city, the hydropower-fueled grid, and the Yangtze-supplied water system. It's as if the river itself recreates its origins, just before passing into the sea. This alpine fragment is sustained by an artificial climate, but artificial climates are connected to the climate outside. Air conditioners run at full blast in the summer, triggering blackouts on the hottest days. The coal and gas that fuel them pump carbon into the atmosphere, driving temperatures even higher. Climate and power are not opposed, but joined. Solar, wind, and water are not only sources of power, but also features of climate. Hydropower, a so-called renewable energy, is itself subject to climate change. The glaciers that feed the Yangtze are melting. A river is a climatic phenomenon.
We've gone from artists that try to simulate and emulate the magic of ice, bringing it to a place where nobody has ever seen it before, to instead artists that start talking about ice as a symbol and as an embodiment of the disaster, the havoc that we're wreaking upon the earth. And we continue with Olafur Eliasson. Now Greenland again will have a very important part in our presentation, so maybe Trump knows something that we didn't know before. But anyway, Olafur Eliasson took this piece of ice from Nuuk in Greenland and brought it the first time to Copenhagen, the second time at the Pantheon in Paris, and the third time in London in the occasion of his exhibition at Tate Modern. And it was left there so that people could actually have this physical and emotional relationship with the ice as it was melting, having a real sense of the fact that the ice in the Arctic is melting. So it's about, once again, trying to bring the reality and the truth home to everybody. Now we go from understanding space to understanding also time. This beautiful video installation by Peggy Weil, 88 cores, is the continuous one-take video that goes down 3 miles. I want to make sure that I say 88 cores descends 2 miles. See, I had it wrong. Through the Greenland ice sheet in one continuous span dating back more than 110,000 years. Because as you know, ice cores really record time. And so Peggy now takes us into the idea of deep time. So ice becomes really also a way to understand the history of the world. And last but not least, the beautiful work of Francis Alice that talks about the unavoidable and ineluctable frivolity and ephemerality of ice. With this particular performance that he did in Mexico City, part of the Paradox of Praxis performances in which he did this futile gestures. So he brought around this ice block for 9 hours around the streets in Mexico City. And of course, it would get easier and easier as the ice melted. But it was also the symbol of complete futility. So it was really a way to give you a sense of how artists have been dealing with the idea of cold, besides, we saw before with Shintaro the idea of ice, and how much cold holds as a way for us to understand the world and to understand also the world beyond our limited, finite dimension as 1, 2, 3 generations of human beings. So now we're going to move to a video by Philippe Ram, and then a second video by, one by Philippe Ram, and then we're going to call David Gibson.
Hello everybody, I'm Philippe Ram, I'm an architect in Paris, and today it's cold outside and I'm in an apartment in Paris, and I would like to explain a little about what is climatic architecture. The idea is to work, to choose form, to design form, and to choose materials through the heat exchange between the human body and the environment. So it's work by convection, by conduction, by evaporation, and by radiation. So if we think about radiation, we have here a window and a sky window. And this window, for example, is bringing some heat when there is sunlight in the winter. But during the night, you have to close it to obscure it, because if not, you will lose all the heat to the outside. This is also the reason why we need to place curtain there. And here, just you can see a radiator, and this radiator, is warming the air, and the air is not going down because it's more light. The hot air is more light, so it's go up, and so it means that in reality, if you follow the heat, it's warming on the top of the ceiling, and then we can go here. We can go on the mezzanine, and this space is warmer because all the heat is going there. So it's why it's interesting to work on the section, to place some warmer space at the top and colder space down. And then about conduction, I have a wool sweater on me, of course, and we need to have thermal insulation there, to block the coolness of the outside. But this location of the thermal insulation can move. You don't have to follow the load-bearing material. So we are free to design. So this is this idea of climatic architecture, is to think about the natural phenomena and to design with that. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye, Philippe. Ciao, ciao. And now I would like to call to the podium David Gibson.
Thank you so much for having me here, and it's great to follow my good friend Philippe. So people who write about the physical and environmental impacts of air conditioning on the development of urban space have written about the development of the Sun Belt in the US Southwest, Singapore in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the development of places like Dubai in the early 2000s. But between the 1960s, how do I advance this? Between the mid-1960s and mid-1980s, more than 1.5 billion cubic feet of air-conditioned space was constructed in Manhattan alone. And this environment influenced transformations in our city's culture and economy, the sensibilities of our buildings, and neighborhood transformations as well. So architects explored how these sealed environments could offer protection from urban pollution, could be places to grow verdant nature, preserve works of art, and support the work of a burgeoning post-industrial workforce. Coal, to talk about what we're examining today, became entangled in debates about the character of interior spaces in cities, urban nature, the creation of the global museum and its collection politics, and the environments necessary to create centers of international finance. So for example, at the Ford Foundation headquarters at 42nd Street, the landscape architect Dan Kiley explored how to grow a large-scale garden inside the comfort zone of Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo's administrative office building that you see here. So Kiley turned to experiments in mechanical biology to ask an unusual question. Given an unchanging interior environment of 65 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit and 20 to 50% humidity, essentially what we're in now, what plants would thrive? And Kiley imagined the interior environment climate that we're in now and is there as a late spring day in the valley that connects Virginia and North Carolina's forests. So he specified trees and plants like magnolias, azaleas, but they all withered and died due to the unchanging interior temperature. And the landscape contractors that maintained this interior discovered that non-tropical plants needed several months of cold to hibernate and retain their energy. So the coldest recorded temperature in the garden was about 63 degrees, but at least 15 degrees more of interior cooling was needed to keep these plants alive. So almost everything you see here was eventually replaced with plants native to warmer climates, and that's what remains there today. And then at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the museum's administrators imagined the ways mechanically conditioned air could support their efforts to expand their global collections. So in their efforts to acquire the Temple of Dendur from Aswan in southern Egypt, they claimed that an air-conditioned space was the only environment that could preserve this ancient monument. So they commissioned the design of several different spaces for the temple and to demonstrate their point. The first that you see at the top was this temporary inflatable that was installed on the museum's south side, and it was designed by the Bird Air Corporation. It was nicknamed the Lung, and the public could go up and view the air-conditioned stones that were kept cold inside of it. And the last space, which is the space that exists today, is the Sackler Gallery's Dendur room, also designed by Roche Dinkeloo. And the temperature of the room, which is kept between 68 and 70 degrees with very low humidity, is about 8 to 10 degrees colder than the average daytime temperature in Aswan. And when it first opened, a few journalists were surprised at the kind of large scale of the room and the way it drew attention away from the temple, but that sort of misses the point. The point of this space is that a beholder in this space who views the temple is also viewing the temple and the environment that justified, for some at least, the reason the artifact is here. And all of this has a type of rhetorical power because between the early 1980s and 2000s, many nations, often in warmer parts of the world, petitioned for the return of their cultural artifacts from US and European museums like this, and many were met with arguments that they simply didn't have the facilities to preserve them with adequate environments. So finally, in Lower Manhattan, the architect Cesar Pelli and interior architect Skidmore Owens Merrill designed a series of monumental buildings and interiors for the financial industry of New York City. And when the World Financial Center that you see at the top was completed, the towers were actually crowned with the city's largest air conditioner chiller plants in all of New York City. And Pelli gave each a home with distinctive tops, the pyramid, ziggurat, and dome. And these air-conditioned systems kept the rooms that you see at the bottom frigidly cold. And Cesar Pelli also gave this atmosphere an architectural aesthetic. In an interview, he argued that the architect of a contemporary office building is faced with a problem that is very different than the architects of the past. They must design an exterior wall of their buildings that keeps air and conditioned air inside. And so the taut, often stretched appearance of Pelli's curtain wall designs, one of the key aspects of his architectural aesthetic, represent his effort to give the containment of conditioned air a type of architectural form. So many of these types of environments that I examined in my 2014 book called Manhattan Atmospheres, was also my dissertation, don't exist anymore, or they've been given completely different characteristics. The Ford Foundation Garden was preserved recently. But many of the city's other interior corporate gardens were demolished or decommissioned in the late 1990s. Many of the large computerized trading rooms have been demolished or retrofitted for other uses. I actually just learned the other night at a dinner party that many of these are actually have been retrofitted and are being used. Anyway, today the excessive energy use of many of these spaces, their insular quality, their completely sealed interiors, are at odds with contemporary architectural environmental politics. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently commissioned Beyer Blinder Bell architects to replace the glass of the Rockefeller wing that you see on the bottom left to reduce the energy use in the gallery by 70%. And then just my final slide. So the problems of energy and emissions dominate contemporary discussions of these types of spaces and their histories, but I think these environments could inspire other responses from us too. So for example, they all rely on assumptions about public health that have become questionable, that we can be in sealed spaces because the power of antibiotics and vaccines. Now, I know we've all gone through thinking about this with the COVID pandemic, but this was actually an idea from the 1960s and 1970s. So the parameters, in other words, the quality of public health enables us to be in a room like we're in right now. So the parameters of air-conditioned spaces are also bound up with representations of geography and race that are both subtle and explicit. So the development of the Ford Foundation Garden, the aesthetics of the Dendor Room, and even the trading rooms I showed begin to illustrate this. And the history of climate control, the history of air conditioning really, is filled with many more examples. Like you can see this British chart on the bottom left that compares the temperature of the comfort zone to the climate of several different cities in Africa. Now finally, these spaces and many of their environmentalist critics extend what I think is an antiquated modernist idea or premise. And that's that the architect, or in this case, the architectural historian or thesis, would propose an environment that is one thing for all the inhabitants of their building. And that's something I think we should question more and more, and these buildings begin to illustrate the problems with that. Thank you.
Wow, I think you agree with Kip then. You know, it's interesting. There's an agreement, and thank you for plunging back in time into your dissertation. We're now having a video by Marwa Koheji, sorry.
In Bahrain in the late 1930s, air conditioning has created a host of social and material changes. One of the most significant is changes in Bahrain's urban and built environment. So prior to air conditioning, people relied on architectural cooling solutions, adopting building design that maximized shade and airflow, and selecting building materials for their ability to resist heat, for example, coral stones that were fetched from the sea. But the arrival of air conditioning would gradually displace the centuries-old architectural cooling solution in favor of a built environment that was maladaptive and primarily introduced by British colonial administrators in the name of modernization. Bahrain at the time being under British colonial control. So heat-absorbing concrete started to be used. The open, airy courtyards that characterize vernacular architecture would also be displaced, and air conditioning would play a role in this transformation by eliminating climate consideration in urban and architectural design. In addition, the technology created unprecedented inequalities in comfort experiences. So in its early decade, for example, it was used primarily by white expatriates whose comforts and leisure were protected at the expense of Bahrainis who mostly worked in the heat. We see these inequalities persist today along different social lines. So it's mostly low-income migrant workers who are exposed to high-stress heat, such as in the construction industry. So there's an ongoing racialized and class-based system of comfort distribution that air conditioning put in place. Along these changes, the technology also changed daily life conventions. So people used to sleep on the rooftop, they would take afternoon siestas to avoid peak heat periods, their clothes, food were adapted to the heat, but the use of air conditioning released any need for behavioral adaptation to the climate. So people started working regardless of temperature outside, and that was also concurrent with the rise of an oil-based capitalist economy in Bahrain. They started dressing up in clothes that find their genealogies in more temperate climates, like the Western professional business suit. So taken together, these changes show that air conditioning not only transformed urban infrastructure, but also social relations and cultural practices in the country.
And now our dessert is Joanna Radin.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here talking about my favorite subject with a bunch of people that I don't have to feel alone anymore. I'm going to tell you a particular transect of the histories we've been hearing that runs through medicine, but also makes stops in agriculture. What you're looking at here is an advertisement, an early advertisement for Electrolux. And what I want to just you to kind of appreciate here is a kind of instantiation of one of the things that Nikki started us out thinking about, the ways in which refrigeration was going to rearrange not only time but space. We have this image here of a certain kind of European representation of diversity. And this is actually an ad from, you can see it's a Portuguese empire, and behind this gas kerosene refrigerator is the Portuguese territories. But this idea of diversity is actually, in human biological variation, is how I got into freezing. I didn't set out to write a book or two or more on refrigeration, which I wound up doing, doing, I was interested in understanding how scientists in the 20th century set out to study and make blood in particular, an otherwise ephemeral substance, into a research material. And I thought, oh, okay, freezing, I'll go to the library, I'll get the best book on scientific refrigeration, and I'll be done. It turned out it didn't exist, so I had to write one. So this is an advertisement for Revco, which is kind of to scientific refrigeration like what Xerox is to copy machines or Kleenex is to tissues. Revco actually stands for Refrigerated Vending Corporation. Before the Second World War, Revco made ice. You could buy ice cream from their vending machines. And like many different industries, Revco was conscripted into the war effort and found a new market in the preservation of blood and other kinds of biomaterials. There was a lot of anxiety with the advent of the atomic bomb that there would be massive shortages of blood. But what people hadn't banked on, or what the physicists hadn't really thought about, was the kind of large-scale impacts and long-term impacts of ionizing radiation released into the atmosphere. So blood wound up being less, although obviously it's still refrigerated for purposes of donation, but it became a kind of like an ice core, a way of taking this otherwise ephemeral substance and freezing it to study both the impacts long-term of radiation, which wouldn't necessarily be discernible for lifetimes, but also to study issues of human evolution and migration. And what I want to point out to you here is merely the tagline at the very, very top. It says the future, comma, inside. And you see all of molecular biology swirling out of this machine, which we might think, well, you have no excuse for thinking of refrigerators as humble at this point in the program. But you see here this really powerful imaginary that the freezer is going to bring science into being. Now, not everybody agreed or agrees. One of the things that I looked at was the way in which many of the people whose bodies were initially prioritized to be collected and put in freezers for scientific study came from indigenous communities around the world who scientists imagined as somehow both closer to nature but also in danger of going extinct. Now, this is a picture from the New York Times of members of a community called the Havasupai, who live in the unceded territory, Arizona, who found out that their ancestors' materials were in freezers and said, you know what, we want it back. So if, just to look here, if you see the freezer was supposed to present a kind of latent life, of life suspended but also deferred until science could find it, we might think of members of these communities as seeing it as a form of incomplete death, wanting not specimens but ancestors back out of the refrigerator. The idea of stopping the biological clock, I think this is amazing. Until I'd done this research, I'd only ever thought of the biological clock in terms of reproduction, like my biological clock is ticking, right? Marissa Tomei has that famous line from my cousin Vinny. But here you see, this is an ad from a biological trade book in the 60s, Stopping the Biological Clock. And on the bottom it says, suspended animation, stopping and starting the biological clock at will has been one of man's age-old dreams, including Jules Verne. Today, through cryobiology, which is the science of frosty life, scientists are slowing down and even theoretically stopping the chemistry of life processes. Now, what you can't see here, but if you would continue reading the article, they would say in the 60s, the people that were doing this in the most interesting and effective way weren't necessarily working with human materials, but other way, with cows. This is an image of the first cow produced from frozen sperm, the little one there named Frosty, fittingly. And it turned out that agricultural breeders, particularly the American Breeders' Service in Wisconsin, which is also one of the major locations of the ice industry in the United States, became a kind of converging point or intellectual trading zone. So you had scientists that had no interest in cows, but lots of interest in humans wanting to learn about this technology, in particular liquid nitrogen. And so you had human biologists and public health officials traveling to Wisconsin and adapting dewars that were supposed to carry sperm into containers that could be used to collect blood. one of the major expeditions that involved the scientists that I followed required the use of this ship called the Alpha Helix, which I think of as and they did too, as a floating freezer, which enabled them to get to otherwise remote regions and collect material and bring it back so that it could be stored in different kinds of ways. But what happened aboard the ship was people would take individual blood samples and subdivide them. So you'd have blood from one individual person that might wind up in multiple labs around the world, which raises a lot of really complicated ethical issues today when people talk about how to deal with human remains. Should they be returned or repatriated? We've kind of lost track. You might be wondering, well, just how many materials are we talking about? In the realm of these kinds of indigenous biospecimens, it's a somewhat smaller amount, but we're talking about millions and millions and millions and probably approaching 1 billion. The best data I could find was collected by RAND Corporation, and this is already almost 20 years old, was saying that there was upwards of 60 million biospecimens. But I just invite you here to pause and think about when you go to the doctor and give a blood sample, do you ever think about what happened to it, or a biopsy? It's not all going in the freezer, but it's not all going in the freezer. So this is samples that were collected on this ship, wound up in a lab in Binghamton, New York. This is a refrigerator from that lab. This is an ordinary Sears kind of refrigerator that was a kind of holding zone. And when I was doing research, I was just amazed to see all the kind of annotation here. This is no food or drink. This is a different kind of repository, but I've also been amazed at the ways in which the same technologies can be repurposed for different ends and have different assumptions that travel along with them. But what fascinated me was this wipe-off board, and I spent about 2 years going back and forth from this one lab that was taking old blood samples and trying to reanimate them in the genomic era. And it said, blood will tell, but it often tells too much. No one in the lab wanted to admit to having written it. Nobody wanted to tell me who wrote it, but everybody had stories about it. And I'm sure you could imagine, think about forensics or paternity or all of these different, finding out, you have some sort of risk factor that you didn't imagine. The kind of blood is palimpsest. Blood as revealing so much, and the ability to freeze it enables these stories to be told and retold in different ways. Indeed, some of the samples that were collected in the 60s were being valued not for the human DNA therein, but for the non-human DNA. They had samples of malaria that had since become drug resistant. So there's this idea if we could travel, back to the future, we might be able to understand new forms of infection control. And I just want to kind of conclude with this issue, which I think captures some of the questions we've talked about, that, most of the work that I've done was dealing with labs, but I showed you this is very much a global project. And when I started this research, one of the cryobiologists I interviewed said, well, why do you want to write about this? It's going away. There's going to be a new thing, he called it anhydrobiosis, which is, the freezing without water. And, this is all going to be a thing of the past, and it's going to be shelf stable, and we're not going to, I don't know, maybe Kip, you have things to say about this. But I want us to kind of think about imagining a kind of visitors from the distant future that might stumble across a fridge henge and try to imagine what it would be trying to warn or tell us. Okay, I, like Nikki, could go on and on and on, but if you want to read more, I have not one, but 2 books, as I told you, and here they are. Thanks so much.
You didn't think that you would need to write 2 books for it. So I would like to call you all to sit here with me. So Joanna, don't go away. You made me think of the Henrietta Lacks, the famous cells, right? This woman that died in the 1950s, and her cells are still used today for experiments. So please come and sit. Yeah, you too, Shintaro. So first of all, to the people that are in the overflow room, you can text me your questions. It's paola_antonelli@moma.org. So if they are great questions, I'll ask them for you. And Nikki, it's up to you and I, but can I ask the first question, because it's going to be a little silly and, somebody that is not an expert. But so, Nikki, you were talking about the artificial cryosphere and the natural cryosphere, and it almost seems like there's this exchange. The more the artificial cryosphere is blossoming, it takes away. So the question is for Kip. Is it a zero-sum game? So we've come to depend, thermodynamics, right? We've come to depend on cold so much. Is cold infinite, or will we run out of cold? Which I know is a paradoxical thing to say.
That is, it's a great question, and I think it gets to...
It's a stupid question, but thank you for saying that it's great.
Well, I think about that all the time.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
I want to make sure my freezer keeps working.
No, it really, it gets to the heart of the physics, honestly, because we get cold by transforming energy from one form to another. And doing that takes work, and that work takes more energy. So it's not so much that cold in of itself is a zero-sum game, it's that the production of cold is usage of resource that right now is primarily not renewable. If electricity was completely renewable, we could make as much cold as we wanted. To one small limit, which is that when I eat a veggie burger and I metabolize it, and then I put that energy into my muscles, and then I rub my hands together and I create heat, well, the energy in that veggie burger, the chemical energy stored in the molecules of that veggie burger, has turned into thermal energy through my hands. How efficient is that process? There's so much loss along the way, and I think fundamentally we need to be looking at ways to reduce that loss in order to not pollute as much with the heat that's created when we create cold.
So as things are right now, will we become extinct because of overheating or because we're going to go into a new glacial era?
I hate to say
These
it.
are like really...
I hate to say it. We're not in a great trajectory in terms of removing the causes of global warming. And my last slide was a cheeky attempt at engaging people who are non-believers in global warming. It's like the science, I'm just going to say it here, it's going to be on YouTube. The science is sound, people. The science is sound. And for those of you who don't believe, I will sell you some refrigerated underwear when you want to have kids, because I'm sorry, the world is getting hotter.
Well, that's what we heard about Nukus and the Aral Sea, absolutely, infertility. Nikki, on to you.
So I think, since we are in a museum, I'll start first with a topic that engages with, one of the things a museum does, which is preserve. And I think this question, I think about it for Shintaro, but also David, but really it goes, any of you could speak to it. This, idea that some things can't be preserved, some things haven't been preserved, like these cold monuments you refer to that are disappearing. And I guess I'm curious, and the Arctic itself is clearly vanishing. How should cold spaces, ice be preserved? Can it be preserved? Should it be preserved? Yeah. Is the fact that we can't really preserve it actually the point? Yeah.
Wow. Okay. But I mean, from all the conversations tonight, it seems like the drive of the conversation is how to preserve and maintain that. I mean, for me, I am that my job is to embrace that, and then to manipulate that into physical embodiment. But within the context of this conversation tonight here, I think it's to maintain that very question, to see the ice melting, and to see the ice being formed, and to see us manipulate it and to appreciate it. On my desk, I have lots of climate, change-related commissions and projects as the Climate Change Week and is coming, and we've done really interesting, projects in the past where, where we have frozen, things, inside, and to have people touch the ice being melted away. And, there have been many amazing projects that others have done and have seen where, the skeleton of the polar bear being frozen with all the ice all around it, and the sculptors will sculpt the polar bears, and then you see that skin that's made out of ice being melting away, So, again, I think for me, my part is to keep the question alive.
I have a question actually for you, Nikki, and it's about the permafrost and the fact that the permafrost has been holding some secrets for humanity and some dangerous secrets for humanity for millennia, and now these secrets, bacteria especially, could become unleashed. Is that a bad sci-fi movie, or it's really something that you see happening?
So I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is yes. I mean, as blood will tell, but it might tell too much. As the ice melts, it will tell, but it might tell too much. And I think it's fascinating to me, the things that are revealed as the ice melts, among them, biohazards, also huge quantities of methane released. And just to, add insult to injury. And the things that we also thought were safe become unsafe. So one of the things, the sort of coda to my book, I decided to go and visit the world's most important freezer, to someone who thinks about food all the time anyway, which is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault.
Oh, yeah.
Where theoretically we are preserving for humanity, the genetic material of all of the things that we need to be able to eat in the future. And it's in Svalbard, buried in the permafrost. Sure, they also have a freezer. It's a very important freezer. But the part of the idea is that this is a stable, cold space for the future. So it's quite hard to get there. They only open it when they're doing deposits. I had to finagle all sorts of things to get in and be one of the people allowed in. And, it cost a fortune to go to Svalbard. I was like, must do it, never mind. I get there, and we're not allowed in. And the reason is because Svalbard had 24 consecutive months of the warmest weather ever, and so much water had melted that it had infiltrated the seed vault and shorted out the freezer. So,
oh my God.
It was just, at the time, I was like, oh no, this is, like, I've come all this way and the ending of my book is ruined. And then I was like, wait, the ending of my book is not ruined. But even, so I do think, as things melt, dangers will be revealed, but also safe spaces are perhaps no longer as safe.
I don't know how many of you remember the blackout in New York. I don't know what you had in the freezer. I had been cooking meat sauce for 3 days, and it was all there. No, I mean, I'm being facetious here, but we can see what happens when cold goes away. Do you mind if I ask another question? I wanted to ask Joanna a question. How does cold allow us to challenge biological time, and when does it get too much? And I was really touched by that picture of the First Nations people in Arizona and how they wanted their ancestors back from the cold. So what have you encountered?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, maybe it was Nikki, but thinking about cold almost becomes cosmological. And, we who are trained up in a particular kind of physics have the idea that, well, the freezer's stopping time. But that depends on what your idea of time is in a certain kind of way. But one of the things that I consistently have encountered is this sense that, and it relates a little bit to what Nikki was just saying, that these scientists who are making these cryo collections imagine that they would persist in perpetuity. But what I think we've heard from a lot of the talks today is that they require a lot of maintenance and care. And so you need to have people that can take care of these things. And what's happening now is that collections of blood, at least, that were made in the 60s, the people who collected them are retiring or dying, and it actually becomes quite difficult to transfer, authority for these materials. They're seen as both incredibly valuable, but in many cases, particularly when you're dealing with indigenous communities, very ethically fraught. And so it's not an uncommon situation to have these kind of frozen collections being maintained, but nobody can use them and they can't be destroyed, and there's not clear if they should be returned. So you get a kind of purgatorial situation. But the question that gets raised is like, when is enough? It's not maybe even as cold infinite, but is the future infinite, or are there horizons when we're thinking about life where we might want to think and embrace concepts of finitude? We saw the image of Ettinger's mother's, brain, and Ettinger, and I think we hear this a lot in tech. There's this fantasy of infinity and of eventually leaving the body behind, which is constraining us on Earth. And I'm really working on this kind of a set of questions about cold got me deeply interested in the question of finitude. And it's a deeply human question, but it's also a question that's totally out of our control, because you may imagine you're creating some kind of infinite backup support, but it might not. I forget also who mentioned unintended consequences. There's always unintended consequences.
That's what I actually love as well then about the ice sculptures that you make, is they dramatize the ending that otherwise we endlessly sort of feel like we can defer. So I wanted to jump in and ask a question that is for both David and Kip about this idea of sealed space. It obviously this kind of architecture and this kind of chilled, conditioned environment relies on a differentiation between inside and out that is carefully maintained and even given aesthetic. Kip blew my mind when we built a fridge by just demonstrating that we were just moving air from inside a box to out of it. And if you didn't have a box, it was like, what's going to happen? The box is the refrigerator. But then it just struck me that you also had a company that was called Gradient, and that seemed to sort of imply a new relationship between inside and outside, and this seal that we've tried to put there. So I guess, more of a comment than a question, as they say, but if you could jump in and talk about inside and outside.
So since, is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, since publishing that book 11 years ago, I've gone to so many environmentalist architecture conferences, and everybody's very critical of this particular time in the post-war era when buildings became sealed, particularly in the United States, but as somebody said, elsewhere in the world. And now we'd be saying, let's open the building up. We need operable windows. We need more porosity. We need less air conditioning. And it's like another extreme. And I think what I'm interested in and what I believe in is that an architect or people who have control over interior space, or designers, whoever, building engineers like Kip, how do we create more heterogeneity so that, it's not just as I was saying, not just one environment for all, but for example, everybody in here sharing one single temperature of space. It's probably a little warmer at the top, a little warmer in the bottom, but it is a sealed space. But how could a room like this or another room have spaces that could open up to the outside or not, just completely depending upon what people need? I'm a big believer that comfort is not something provided by an architect, but something that's like achieved as a kind of debate between the inhabitant of a building and their surroundings. And I haven't really seen an adequate architectural response to that idea, or an engineering response. Yeah.
I'm working on both. I love to hear that, because it's there's an organization called ASHRAE, the American Society for Heating Refrigeration Engineers, and the one of the big problems is that if I'm an architect or a building engineer, and I will qualify this by saying that my original degrees are in biomedical engineering, and the reason that I got into the field of HVAC was because I was very interested in thermal comfort for people. So everything that I look at in terms of energy in buildings comes through this lens of thermal comfort. I was in a meeting, I was a grant reviewer and advisor for a Department of Energy program that was looking at personalized thermal comfort, and had awarded like $50 million of our taxpayer funds to these research projects, 0 of which had anyone with a human comfort biology background. It was like physics and chemists. And it's like, where's the human in all of this? So ASHRAE creates the standards that all of these buildings are designed to. And it's not so much ASHRAE's fault that buildings are designed to the standard, it's the risk aversion of the architect and the engineering community. Nobody wants to build a building and be told, well, you built that wrong, everyone's uncomfortable, you are liable for replacing it, for fixing it, tearing it down and building it again in a better way. So we rely on the standards to say, well, I built it to the standard, bye. And now you have a building, the research has shown that most people in buildings are uncomfortable, thermally uncomfortable. And that's the homogeneity. If you're trying to make it perfect for one person, you make it imperfect for everyone. And if you create that heterogeneity, the diversity of experiences, I can experience comfort in one area and discomfort in another area. I can move to a more comfortable area. The change in going from one space to another creates the sensation of awareness and the ability, like researcher at Center for the Built Environment at Berkeley, Gail Brager, had to fight for like 10 years to have operable windows included in these standards, because it's that idea that you're creating a space that is not uniform, and it introduces the outside environment, which is different around the world. And oh my gosh, how are we going to reconcile that difference against the need for the building designers to be able to walk away and say, I did this right because I did it to the standard, so I have no liability when everyone's uncomfortable. So there's so much there, and like, I'm not going to rant about this more because I've been researching it for the last 5 years.
I just said one quick thing. The standards, as you know, were written in the 20s based upon a study of men at Harvard,
exactly.
undergraduate men between the ages of 18 and 20. So everybody in here who's between 18 and 20 who has an elite education must be very comfortable. But the rest of us are miserable, right?
I know. I was very touched by Marwa's video, actually.
Yeah.
She was talking about Bahrain and how Bahrain was changed. I mean, the whole culture, the clothes, everything. I mean, even just when I go back to Italy, where I'm from, and there's much less air conditioning, there are some clothes that I cannot wear here in the summer. Some clothes that are really like nice summer clothes, and I would never be able to do it because actually, with all my colleagues, we have blankies at the office that are for summer months in particular. So I have a question for you. The biggest changes in culture that you have encountered studying refrigeration, like you did a beautiful story about East Africa. So where did you see the biggest revolutions, cultural revolutions, for good and for bad?
So as part of the book, I went to China, which is a really interesting case study for anyone wanting to understand what happens when you refrigerate a society in real time, because what happened was that the Chinese decided to make refrigeration one of their priorities in the 12th five-year plan. And so if China decides to do that, it happens, and overnight, basically. And so what was fascinating about going to this country where refrigeration had been imposed, something that in the US took decades and met a lot of cultural resistance and had to be absorbed sort of piecemeal and affected its changes piecemeal, and thus is sort of harder to tease out. You could see in real time one woman across the hall with her, her pork outside her window, hanging from the balcony to stay cold, and across the hall, a younger couple saying that their fridge was their most important possession, more important even than their cell phones, because without it they couldn't feed their baby safely. And you could see people say, yes, of course, frozen dumplings. We always buy frozen dumplings because it takes too long to make dumplings and you have to make them for too many people. It's a communal act. And then other, older women saying, no, it's the Chinese people's way to make dumplings together for a feast. Like the purpose of the cuisine is for that occasion. So it was just an astonishing kind of real time. And it's happening, everything from how much food is wasted and where that happens to what is eaten. And even still the points of friction. So, fish it just cannot be eaten unless it was alive seconds ago. And so rather than even the sort of Chinese 5-year plan had to hold up a little there. And scientists were tasked with developing a way of shipping fish around the country in chilled, kind of like poster tubes full of water, so that they were sort of sleeping. They were kind of slowed into sleep. The room where this was being prototyped was called the room of the sleeping fish. And so, but yeah, so seeing that adaptation occur in real time, I recommend any sort of connoisseur of cold to visit China and see. I mean, we have a room full of them here, where I am among good friends.
Absolutely. So you want to ask another question, then maybe we open to the audience? Yeah.
Well,
No, you go.
You
Go
sure?
for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
I don't want to take it away. So I think something about the effort that goes into cold and making it visible is really interesting to me. And I think typically that's been hidden. And a lot of the artwork that Paula showed made it visible. And I was, very curious, and this is a question again to all of you, whoever wants to jump in, to think about the idea of making that effort visible in our current systems, where it's visible, why it's being made invisible, and what it would do to make it visible.
I'll jump in. I had a slide which was the gold-plated toilet in my presentation originally because I wanted to highlight that point. We when I was presenting for my faculty presentation for MIT, I had like one slide out of all this other stuff around biomedical engineering, innovation, whatever. There was some HVAC projects, and that like clicked with my colleagues. And after my presentation, instead of talking about my theories on artificial intelligence in 2015 and how like programming languages were going to use AI, whatever, they're like, so you do HVAC, and this building's really uncomfortable. You could like fix the heating and cooling in this building. I said, no. I just came from consulting to Intel and working on their 10-year long-term strategic plan with the CTO. I'm not your HVAC technician. But what occurred to me was, we have this infrastructure that is so important to our lives. And I'll start with the toilet. What would happen if toilets just went away? What would life be like? We take these things for granted. And artists reflect on that, and so we have gold-plated toilets that are in museums. There's no gold-plated air conditioner sitting in a museum yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Because it's a technology that engineers have really approached from just purely the physics point of view. How much energy can I put in, and what happens to it, and what do I get out on the other side? Very few people connect that to the humanity of it, to the impact on our lives, to the role it plays in everyday society, to this conversation here. And I think it's really important that we change that. It's really important to me personally to create air conditioning and refrigeration as objects of desire. And I don't mean desire like I need the air conditioning, refrigeration, and I need the effects of it, because we take that desire for granted. But I mean the aesthetic desire, the pleasure that comes from looking at, what right now is this dumb rectangular white box in a window and changing it, and the gradient system, you can like put a plant on it, and it's beautiful. It's designed by the same person, one of the designers from Nest. And we can change the language to create an awareness of the object and its function. instead of just taking the function for granted, like the toilet.
Amen.
There are things like the Pompidou Center, right? With the
what?
Pompidou Center
Yes.
that has a very expressive air
Oh, yeah,
conditioning system.
absolutely.
But that's
This is
rare,
the
and that's
arguing
right.
for designers, really good
Yeah.
designers, to be involved.
But also the sorry, just
Yeah.
really quickly, the Guggenheim Museum, a lot of people don't know this, but the ramp is actually also the duct for the air conditioning, and the end is actually very thick. And that
I didn't know
parapet,
that.
only like half of it is an actual parapet, the rest is the duct, which is built into the concrete.
scary
And so
parapet.
Frank Lloyd Wright wanted the spiral to be a spiral of air also, which, like if you go there, look, you'll see the ducts at the end.
But it's still so hidden, you know, and I like that's a beautiful point.
It's the first hermetically sealed museum
Guys,
in here.
let me let somebody else. All right.
The air conditioning is very exciting.
Alphonse let me pre-vet his question. It's actually good. So Alphonse is here. Where is the? Yeah, here it comes. And then I saw you. Yeah. Maybe it's for Joanna, I think.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Paula and Nick, for convening this wonderful thing. I'm Alphonse. I'm a current graduate student at Yale School of Architecture, so long I will track back. To keep Joanna and David, I'm particularly drawn to this notion of risk and futurity that is embedded within this cryo regime, where the uncertainty of the future is very much answered by the act of freezing a moment, or in some of David's case studies, maintaining a stable environment so that production and labor can be optimized and maintained. As the climate crisis accelerates, how do each of you maybe feel about the paradigm of the future and how it can evolve? Is mitigation and management through advancements in air conditioning technologies of freezing still tenable, or is it time that we let things defrost and decay as ancestors should and would?
All right,
Thanks, Joanna.
I'll take that. I will be teaching a class at Yale in a few years with Eli Hobart, who wrote a brilliant book called Cooling the Tropics about the introduction of ice to Hawaii. We're teaching a class called Rot. So look us up. But yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I guess one thing I could say is that what comes up is that, and this relates to what we've just been talking about, that some of the ways that cold is deployed, particularly in biomedicine, it's almost Baroque. Like, you don't actually need liquid nitrogen to do the kinds of thing, like the temperature's that low, to do what is being done, especially if, say, you're prioritizing DNA. DNA is pretty shelf stable, but you've got this stuff at ultra low temperatures, and I think that's one way to think about it. Although, of course, if you're preserving gametes like eggs or sperm, it's a different issue. But I think this is a really important question, and it's one that I've had to wrestle with, in particular by considering other kinds of cultural, cosmological approaches to futurity, to time, to the relationship between space and time. And I think there's a good case, for letting go, because there's a certain almost hoarding mentality that comes into play with a lot of these kinds of collections where people don't even know what they have. And just to give an example from biomedicine, every few years you hear a story of someone saying at Fort Detrick, like, I didn't know I found anthrax in the back of the freezer. I didn't know that was there. The same way you're like, I didn't know that pot pie was still in there. And so I think that if you start to look at some of the ways in which these technologies are used or are imagined to be able to just be perpetually self-sustaining, where the human is and all that labor is extracted, then it might be provide a heuristic for thinking about what are we actually doing when we're freezing and when we're preserving, and who is that for? Is it for our future selves? You see in the case of cryonics that it's often people who don't have children, they're imagining themselves as their own future kin, and that's interesting to think about how freezing can rearrange kinship in these ways. But I do think that we're ripe for a conversation about overripeness, maybe.
Exactly. I thought you would do. So there was, he was first there, and then we'll come here.
So first of all, thank you so much. It's been a great event. So a lot of the climate messaging and stories that you told, and as well as demonstrated through a lot of the videos, were very moving. But of course, climate is super difficult. I design museums, and I know firsthand they're awful to be able to engage people in. So I wanted to invite you to maybe expound a little bit further on some of the positive solutions that you've encountered. I know, Nikki, you mentioned these hyper-thin membranes that can fit over fruit. You sort of touched on that a little bit, as well as load balancing different buildings. Maybe talk a bit about the barriers to scaling them, and then maybe the mindset that people would need to embrace them in the future.
I mean, I'll just jump in because this is one of the things that I think could, it's rare you get win-wins, but in fact, although refrigeration has delivered fresh food, it hasn't, as a general rule, made our food more delicious. Obviously beer, definitely ice cream, but not peaches and definitely not tomatoes. And so one of the things that I think is exciting is to say, okay, if we can remember that we didn't used to think refrigerated food was fresh, so maybe food doesn't have to be refrigerated to be fresh. So what about if we preserve food differently? And this is other than survival and reproduction, this is like humanity's great project is food preservation and making sure that we have food and that the microbes and fungi that want to eat it before us don't. And I feel like let's dedicate our minds to that. Fortunately, people who actually have brilliant ideas are doing that. The issues that they're running into. And you can do amazing things. I mean, there's a company in Santa Barbara, this Appeal company, that actually manages to slow the respiration and metabolism of produce to the same extent that a refrigerator slows it, simply with a coating that is made of the same lipids in baby milk that just changes how it respires. So it just does that at room temperature. And you can go and visit it and see, 8-week-old bell peppers at room temperature with this coating on them that would still be perfectly respectable in a stir fry. And so what's astonishing is that they have run into Walmart was going to start using their technology on cucumbers, and everyone knows how disappointing cucumbers are in the fridge. They're sad, they're slimy. So Walmart was all set up to do this, and there was a huge backlash. People were like, oh no, because I don't want my food to last longer. I want it to be fresh. I was like, peeps, you do not know how old your food is right now. That is by making our refrigerated network invisible, we no longer have any idea the effort and the time and the geography that goes into getting it to us. We think it's fresh. We can't believe that something that has this coating on it that lasts for longer at room temperature could possibly be fresh. And so that is both, I know I was trying to be optimistic, but there's an issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there was somebody there? No, then here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Here she comes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. I was reading recently about the speed of drone delivery, especially with respect to organs, and it seems like there is this inverse relationship between speed of transport and the need for preservation, which got me thinking about whether we're approaching the problem from the right angle and if there's another way to skin the cat. So rather than building better refrigeration systems, what if we just built faster transportation systems or other systems that would obviate the need for preservation altogether? And I was also thinking about how culturally and psychologically we might adapt in a more resilient fashion to not having everything that we need on demand the way that we now feel entitled to because of refrigeration.
Okay, Nikki?
So,
something to respond to?
Absolutely, and Walmart is already using drones in Arkansas to deliver perishable goods directly from the distribution warehouse to people's stores without refrigeration because they just get there quickly enough. And it's like when Kip showed the fresh truck. If you can remove some nodes, you can eliminate. Streamline the need for refrigeration. So absolutely, the future may not be refrigerated, and there are a variety of ways around that. Also, yes, the idea of this we've become accustomed to abundance. It looks one way to us now, and perhaps a certain, not having everything you want all the time is it could make us appreciate the things we have when we have them. I thought of that sort of stockpiling quality when with the Temple of Dendur. Like maybe we can't see an Egyptian temple in Manhattan,
I want to throw in one very quick comment, which is thermodynamics is just an accounting system. It lets you keep track of energy in different forms and how it moves back and forth through different forms. I love that idea. You just need to account for the energy required to transport faster versus the energy required to refrigerate and see which one wins out.
So I want to take my privilege and use it with one last question to Shintaro. You told that you use an ice that has no bubbles, that has a special make to it. How do you make that ice, and does that ice exist in nature?
Okay, sure. I think there's a lot of myth often to making crystal clear ice, like double boiling the water and all that stuff. But there's basically two important elements, which is basically one direction freezing, and also agitation, moving water, freezing, moving water. So those two important factors are built into the industry standard ice machines that make sculpture blocks, that makes crystal clear ice. It's slower growth, but by freezing one direction from bottom up, usually with insulations all around it, for the rest, it keeps the air bubbles on the surface. And by moving the water, all the impurities and all the bubbles continue to remain on the surface, and it just moves up. In nature, it's basically lake water or creek water, you see. But except, lake water, it's the opposite, the reversed. You have the lake water is always usually kind of circulating, slowly moving, and it freezes from top down. So you see the first layer of cloudy ice of the compacted snow, but once you pass that, you have very clear ice. So you see one of the pictures, from the ice houses from the past, from the Hudson valleys and all that, or a lot of the renowned ice sculpture competitions in the way up north in the Arctic. They will cut lake ice and they will pull those out. And I've had the privilege of carving ice at Ice Alaska or up in Fairbanks. And there it's very special, very coveted. It's a pilgrimage for many ice carvers around the world, where you have 6-7 feet thick crystal clear, actually beyond crystal clear, it's almost blue. Ice that gets pulled out and carved, So, that's the method. One thing I wanted to say in this conversation tonight is I feel like the conversation was very narrow in the context of what the cold concept is. Because for me, every day, it's the incremental elements, what 15 degree does to our, sculptures, to what 18 degree does, and how our machines, like CNC machines, operate, to how our cube machine saws operate. We really have physically, kind of empirically fine-tuned it by degree to degree. And I see that being manipulated many other factors from culinary. I had a project with a Japanese sake company, Hakkai-san, actually, which is the snow houses, where they have a facility where it's not an ice house, but it's a snow house, and it's a fine, delicate balance of moisture and cold, and how that can create certain peak of flavor or preservations.
I love that. And I love, because actually our refrigerators aren't the ideal environment for most of our food. And we try and finagle it a little by having a crisper drawer or, something that's more humid and less, is nothing.
Yeah.
Like
I often laugh at those drawers. So give me.
No, come on, no, it's great. I was thinking as you were speaking of that novel, Zmilla, Sense of Snow. I remember reading it before the movie many years ago, and just thinking of all these different types of cold that exist.
Yeah. I actually had a great conversation that I did with an architect, Masayuki Sono. He's with Clouds Architecture. He's based in New York, but he had a project with NASA architecture, a structure out of ice in Mars, and how ice was potentially an optimal material, and they were investigating, kind of creating that out of 3D printers and whatnot, and I was asking him about, well, how thick, what about the radiations, and what about the airflows and moistures, all that kind of stuff, and it could really unwind and get really complicated very quickly when it comes to ice.
Well, as always, these salons are a plunge into a universe, too, don't think. But it really, this coming together of science, history, architecture, and then also the little smattering of art that Christina and I brought to you really shows how we all have to come together from all different disciplines if we want to actually move the needle a little bit in culture and change behaviors. So once again, it was such a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to the video makers. Had the pleasure of enjoying her company tonight. But if we go outside, there's going to be Shintaro sculpture. Then there's going to be Kip's demo, the usual soggy snacks and so wine, and more conversation. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Paola.
Oh, and also, sorry, I forgot. There's also going to be very important. Nicola's book is also outside, and
I can sell
it's
books.
Yay, good. Thank you, Nikki.
That was incredible.
It was fun.
So you're cool people.
I know.
From way back.
I know.
I wasn't.
Okay.
I was thinking for like a paper and it was fun. I haven't thought
What?
about it.
Thank you so much.
For revisiting.
Oh my God, of course.
Different control knobs that you can turn to modify how energy is used, keeping the servers at temperature. No human has the ability to build a model that effectively. So all we do is, some basic rules years. But what we would
Like accounting, like it's sort of like a turtle all the way down.
Leveraging it. You're creating 2 million inputs to the system with 2 million outputs.